The county courthouse always carried a strange energy on Monday mornings. The building, with its tall stone columns and heavy iron doors, loomed over the downtown square like a silent judge of its own. The inside was no less intimidating. Polished marble floors echoed footsteps. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the air smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and nervous sweat. People crowded into the main courtroom that day, clutching thick folders of evidence, legal briefs, and anxiously whispered prayers. Among the crowd, whispers traveled faster than the clock ticked. A boy, no older than 19, maybe 20 at most, was sitting quietly on the defendant's side of the courtroom. He wore a plain button-up shirt, dark slacks, and polished shoes that looked too neat for someone his age. No lawyer sat beside him. No parent hovered nearby. He was completely alone. Spectators muttered to one another, trading theories in low voices. Must be some juvenile case. Maybe he couldn't afford a lawyer. Looks like he's about to cry already. But the boy wasn't crying. He wasn't even nervous. His posture was straight, his hands folded neatly on the table, and his eyes focused on the bench where the judge would soon sit. At precisely 9 o'clock, the side door opened and the bailiff announced, "All rise." The judge strode in, a man in his late 60s with a face that seemed permanently etched into a scowl. He had presided over this courtroom for decades, earning a reputation as someone who enjoyed mocking those who came unprepared. Some whispered he relished the chance to belittle anyone younger, poorer, or less educated than himself. When his eyes fell on the teenager, his expression twisted into amusement. He adjusted his glasses and muttered just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Well, this will be quick." The case was called. The clerk read the details. An HOA lawsuit over unpaid fines, alleged violations of community rules, and property damage fees that added up to several $1,000s. To most, it sounded routine, the kind of case that usually ended with the homeowner paying up, sometimes after a lecture. But the unusual part was this. The homeowner listed in the complaint was the teenager sitting alone at the table. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom again. A boy owning property? It didn't make sense. The judge raised an eyebrow and leaned forward. "Well now," he said with a chuckle. "Do you even understand why you're here, son? This isn't traffic court. This is civil litigation. You know what that means, don't you?" The boy didn't flinch. He reached down, pulled a thick leather folder from his bag, and placed it squarely on the table. His hands moved with the calm precision of someone far more experienced than his age suggested. The judge smirked, assuming it was a bundle of irrelevant papers, maybe internet printouts or half-baked research. To him, this boy looked like easy prey, a chance to flex his authority in front of a crowded room. "You know you can request a lawyer, right?" the judge added, still mocking. "Unless, of course, you think you can handle this on your own." The courtroom chuckled. A few people shook their heads, already predicting disaster. They expected the boy to stammer, to beg for leniency, or to fold under pressure. But the boy did none of those things. He calmly opened his folder, revealing neatly tabbed sections filled with legal briefs, precedent cases, and typed motions. His expression remained neutral, almost unreadable, as though he had rehearsed this moment 100 times. The judge cleared his throat and shifted in his chair, slightly irritated that his jokes weren't drawing the same laughter as before. He tapped his gavel lightly, a subtle warning that he was still in control. "Very well," he said. "Let's hear from the plaintiff." The HOA's attorney, a man in a sharp gray suit, stood confidently. He launched into a practiced speech about community rules, how the boy had allegedly violated them, and how fines had gone unpaid for months. His tone dripped with condescension, as though speaking down to someone too young to understand the law. When the attorney finished, all eyes turned back to the teenager. The judge smirked again. "Your turn, son. Try to keep it brief." What happened next silenced the courtroom. The boy stood slowly, placed his hands firmly on the table, and spoke with a voice that carried far more authority than anyone expected. He didn't stumble. He didn't hesitate. Each word was precise, calculated, and backed by something far stronger than confidence: knowledge. He cited case law. He referenced statutes. He pointed out procedural errors in the HOA's filing, things that even seasoned attorneys often overlooked. He moved seamlessly between his notes and memory, weaving an argument that was airtight from the very first sentence. The courtroom sat frozen. The smirks faded. Even the judge's grin faltered as he leaned forward, listening more intently than before. Who was this boy? How could someone so young dismantle an argument with the precision of a seasoned litigator? Whispers spread across the benches. Some leaned forward, eager to catch every word. Others stared at the judge, waiting for his reaction. The judge's expression shifted from amusement to something else: irritation, maybe even unease. But his pride wouldn't let him admit it. He banged his gavel, cutting off the boy mid-sentence. "That's enough," the judge snapped. "We'll continue this properly." But deep down, a question lingered in his mind. Had he underestimated the one person in the room he thought would be easiest to humiliate? The boy sat down, calmly closing his folder as though nothing unusual had happened. His face remained unreadable, his demeanor unshaken. For now, the judge still believed he could regain control. But what he didn't realize was that the teenager was only getting started. The trap had been set, and every move from here on out would tighten it further. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but they were witnessing the beginning of a legal showdown they would talk about for years. The air in the courtroom grew heavy after the teenager's first response. At first, people thought it was luck, maybe something he had memorized from a website. But as he calmly tucked his notes back into the folder and waited, a silent ripple passed through the benches. Something about him was different. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't playing the part of a nervous youth. He was deliberate, collected, and unnervingly composed. The judge, unwilling to let his authority slip, leaned back with a smirk that had already begun to crack. He adjusted his glasses, tapped the gavel against the bench, and cleared his throat loudly. "That was spirited," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But this isn't a classroom debate, son. This is a court of law. And if you think reading off a few internet cases makes you a lawyer, you're sorely mistaken." The courtroom chuckled again, though weaker this time. The earlier confidence in their laughter had faded. They had seen the boy cite laws with startling precision, and though they didn't fully understand them, they sensed he wasn't just repeating something he'd skimmed online. Still, they deferred to the judge's authority. Surely he couldn't be wrong. The HOA's attorney, still puffed up with confidence, seized the moment. He launched into another tirade, this time more pointed, attacking the boy personally. He mocked his age, questioned his understanding, and even suggested he was wasting the court's time. With each insult, the attorney's voice grew louder, angrier, more desperate to bury the boy under ridicule. But then the boy stood again. He didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He simply placed one hand on his folder, raised the other slightly, and asked the judge for permission to respond. The judge, still convinced he had the upper hand, waved dismissively. "Go ahead, son. Entertain us." And that's when everything began to change. The teenager's voice carried across the courtroom, calm but firm. He didn't waste time on emotions or counter-insults. Instead, he cut straight to the heart of the matter, dissecting the HOA attorney's arguments with surgical precision. Point by point, he revealed flaws in the plaintiff's filings. He highlighted how the HOA had misapplied its own rules, how its board members had violated their own bylaws, and how fines had been issued without proper notice. A direct violation of state law. The attorney shifted uncomfortably, his earlier smirk fading. The spectators leaned forward, caught between disbelief and fascination. Every time the boy turned a page, another carefully documented piece of evidence emerged: certified letters the HOA had failed to send, meeting minutes that contradicted their claims, and even a copy of the HOA's own handbook, marked and highlighted to reveal their hypocrisy. The judge tried to interject, but each time the boy respectfully but firmly redirected him back to the statutes and precedents that governed the case. He wasn't just throwing out random fact, and he was weaving a coherent, airtight argument that left no room for dismissal. And then came the moment that shifted the entire atmosphere. The boy calmly cited a case from the state Supreme Court, one that directly invalidated the kind of fines the HOA had levied against him. The citation was precise, the interpretation flawless. He even had a printed copy of the ruling, neatly highlighted, which he offered to the court. Gasps echoed through the room. Even those unfamiliar with the law understood what this meant. The boy wasn't bluffing. He wasn't stumbling his way through. He knew exactly what he was doing. The judge froze. His mocking grin evaporated. For the first time, his authority seemed shaken. He leaned forward, studying the documents, his fingers tightening on the gavel. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. And then, unable to hide his irritation, the judge snapped. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. His voice no longer carried amusement. It carried suspicion, even unease. The boy met his gaze without blinking. His reply was measured, respectful, and devastatingly simple. "The law library, Your Honor. The same place every attorney is supposed to start." The room erupted in whispers. Some laughed nervously. Others shook their heads in disbelief. But the point was undeniable. The teenager had just outmaneuvered not only the HOA's attorney but also the judge who had mocked him. The judge slammed his gavel, ordering silence. But his voice lacked the same commanding tone it had carried earlier. For the first time in decades, he was no longer the smartest man in the room. The HOA's attorney, now visibly sweating, attempted to salvage his argument. He stuttered, trying to redirect attention to the boy's age, suggesting that no matter how well prepared he was, he couldn't possibly represent himself properly. But the boy was ready. He pulled another document from his folder, a notarized letter confirming that he was legally permitted to appear pro se, representing himself in the case. He read aloud the statute that granted him that right. The attorney slumped, his voice faltering. The judge leaned back, rubbing his temples. And that's when the teenager revealed the ace he had been holding back. He calmly explained that he wasn't just fighting for himself. He had been quietly studying law for years, shadowing attorneys, attending public hearings, and mastering the very system designed to intimidate people like him. He wasn't here by accident. He was here by design. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. People exchanged wide-eyed glances. The judge's mocking tone had completely vanished. His eyes narrowed, studying the boy with a mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. For the first time, the judge realized the truth. This wasn't a naive teenager fumbling through a case. This was someone who had walked into court with a strategy, a plan, and knowledge most practicing attorneys would envy. And yet, the boy hadn't revealed everything. Not yet. He had more evidence, more precedents, more surprises waiting. Each one a nail in the coffin of the HOA's case. The judge, once so eager to mock him, now found himself on the defensive. His gavel tapped nervously. His smirk was gone. His authority felt fragile. And as the teenager calmly sat back down, neatly folding his hands once again, the entire courtroom knew. This was no ordinary case. This was the beginning of a legal showdown that would flip the balance of power upside down. The boy had turned the tables. The mockery was over. The shock had only just begun. The silence that followed the teenager's words was unlike anything the courthouse had experienced in years. Spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering in disbelief. The bailiff, usually stone-faced and unmoved by theatrics, leaned slightly forward as if trying to catch every detail. Even the clerk, who had spent decades recording monotonous exchanges, sat frozen, her pen hovering mid-air. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room. His gavel slammed against the block, but the sound no longer carried the same weight as before. His smirk was gone, replaced by a strained tightness around his mouth. For the first time in a long career, he wasn't sure how to proceed. He had been so certain that this boy would fold under pressure. Instead, The boy had shifted the entire balance of power. "Order," the judge barked, though his voice trembled slightly. "This is still my courtroom." But the statement rang hollow. Everyone could feel it. Authority had quietly shifted to the young man at the defendant's table. The HOA's attorney shuffled his papers frantically. His once confident posture slouched. His tie, perfectly knotted at the start of the morning, now seemed suffocating against his throat. Sweat dotted his forehead as he flipped through files that suddenly felt flimsy, irrelevant, and dangerously insufficient. The teenager sat perfectly still, his expression calm, his folder neatly stacked in front of him. When the murmurs died down, he stood again, moving with the deliberate patience of someone who knew the spotlight was his. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady but unyielding. "The plaintiff's filings contain not only procedural errors but outright contradictions. May I direct the court's attention to page 14 of the HOA's bylaws?" The judge frowned but nodded reluctantly. The boy held up a copy of the bylaws, highlighted in multiple colors, each section tabbed with precision. He read aloud a passage that clearly stated fines could not be enforced without prior mediation, a mediation the HOA had skipped entirely. Then, without missing a beat, he flipped to meeting minutes showing the board's decision to bypass that requirement. The courtroom gasped again. The HOA's attorney tried to object, but his voice cracked. The teenager calmly overrode him, citing the state statute that required mediation before fines could be imposed. The citation rolled off his tongue as easily as a rehearsed line in a play. The judge glanced at the documents, his eyes narrowing. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, aware that the boy was right. The more the teenager spoke, the more the case unraveled. But the boy wasn't finished. He reached into his folder and pulled out a stack of certified mail receipts. "These," he explained, "are the notices I should have received from the HOA. As you can see, none of them were sent. In fact, they didn't even attempt proper service until after filing this lawsuit. By their own negligence, they invalidated their claim." The receipts were passed to the clerk, who handed them to the judge. His face tightened as he read them. He tried to mask it, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. The attorney's confidence collapsed. His voice faltered as he attempted to argue, but every point was immediately dismantled by the boy with citations and precedents. The teenager moved through his arguments like a chess master dismantling an amateur player, anticipating every counter and striking before the move was even made. The spectators were enthralled. Some leaned forward, mouths open in disbelief. Others shook their heads in admiration. The story spreading through the benches was clear. This wasn't just luck. This wasn't just a clever kid. This was something more. And then, the judge snapped again. "Enough," he thundered, slamming his gavel. His voice echoed, but it no longer carried authority. It carried frustration, even fear. His eyes bored into the teenager. "Who are you?" The room fell silent. Everyone waited. The boy didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, he opened his folder once more. From the bottom, he pulled a sealed envelope. He handed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the bench. The judge tore it open and scanned the contents, his face drained of color. It was a license. Not just any license. A temporary certificate of admission to practice law, granted under a state program for prodigious students who had passed the bar exam at an unusually young age. Gasps filled the courtroom. The boy wasn't just representing himself. He wasn't just a clever teenager with a library card. He was a fully licensed attorney, one of the youngest in the state's history. The judge's gavel slipped slightly in his hand. His eyes flicked back to the boy, who stood calmly, his expression unchanged. The humiliation was palpable. The man who had mocked him, laughed at him, dismissed him as a foolish child, now realized he had been sparring with a legitimate lawyer, and losing. The HOA's attorney's mouth fell open. He stuttered, his arguments collapsing entirely. His face turned crimson as he shuffled his papers, fully aware that he had been dismantled in front of an entire courtroom by someone half his age. The boy spoke again, his voice measured but carrying the weight of authority. Your Honor, the plaintiff has wasted this court's time with baseless claims, filed in bad faith, and executed in violation of state statutes. I move for dismissal with prejudice and request the court consider sanctions for abuse of process. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Words like sanctions, dismissal with prejudice, and bad faith rippled through the crowd. Even those unfamiliar with legal jargon understood the gravity. The HOA wasn't just losing, they were about to be punished for trying to game the system. The judge swallowed hard. His arrogance was gone. His pride had been shattered. He glanced at the spectators, then back at the boy, and finally at the attorney, who looked ready to sink into the floor. For years, the judge had mocked and belittled those who came before him. But in this moment, it was he who had been mocked by reality. His laughter had turned into silence. His arrogance had turned into humiliation. And the boy, the so-called teenager, had revealed himself as a force far beyond anyone's expectations. The gavel slammed once more, not with authority, but with resignation. The judge's voice cracked slightly as he muttered, "Motion under advisement." But the damage was already done. The courtroom would never forget what they had witnessed. A genius attorney in disguise had walked in like prey and left as predator. The judge's reputation was shaken, the HOA attorney's career likely ruined, and the boy's legend had only just begun. As he sat down, folding his hands neatly once more, the spectators could only stare. They had come expecting humiliation, but instead, they had witnessed brilliance. And they knew the real battle was still to come. The sun outside had already shifted, spilling golden beams through the courthouse windows. Dust motes drifted lazily in the light, indifferent to the chaos unfolding inside. For hours, the courtroom had transformed into a theater of power, humiliation, and revelation. What had begun as a routine HOA case had spiraled into something legendary, the public unmasking of a boy genius who had humiliated seasoned professionals and shaken the very judge who had mocked him. But everyone knew the climax was near. The judge sat slumped in his chair, shoulders heavier than ever before. The weight of his arrogance pressed on him as he shuffled through the documents that now mocked him with their truth. He had once laughed at this boy, written him off as a child playing games, but now, those papers cut through his pride like sharpened glass. He had been exposed in front of his peers, in front of an audience, in front of history itself. The HOA's attorney, pale and sweating, whispered frantically to the board members sitting behind him. Their faces twisted in horror as they realized the full scope of the disaster. What they thought was a simple lawsuit had turned into a public relations nightmare and a legal catastrophe. Their whispers turned into frantic muttering, their eyes darting to the exits as if planning an escape. But escape was no longer an option. The teenager, no, the attorney, sat calm and unshaken, his posture almost regal despite his age. He didn't fidget, didn't flinch. His composure was that of someone who had already seen the ending and was merely watching the pieces fall into place. Finally, the judge straightened, his gavel tapping softly against the bench. His voice, usually booming and confident, carried a tremor. "This court will now render its decision," he said, though it sounded less like a declaration and more like a plea for control. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every spectator leaned forward, eyes wide, breaths held. Even the courthouse clock seemed to hesitate, its ticking drowned beneath the tension. The judge looked at the HOA's attorney first, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "This case," he said slowly, "was brought in bad faith. The plaintiffs ignored their own bylaws, failed to follow required procedures, and wasted the time of this court with sloppy, dishonest filings." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. The HOA board members flinched as though struck by invisible whips. The judge's gaze shifted to the boy. His voice faltered before he spoke again. "The defendant—" He paused, correcting himself. "Attorney Williams has demonstrated a mastery of both fact and law that leaves this court no choice but to dismiss the case with prejudice. Gasps filled the courtroom. With prejudice. That meant the HOA could never bring this claim against him again. It was not just a dismissal, it was permanent. Final. Absolute. But the judge wasn't finished. His hands gripped the bench as if bracing himself. Furthermore, he continued, the plaintiffs will be sanctioned for abuse of process. They are hereby ordered to pay the defendants legal fees and additional fines to this court for their misconduct. The HOA's attorney's jaw dropped. His hands trembled as he clutched at his tie, loosening it like a man suffocating. Behind him, the board members erupted in whispers of panic. One clutched his head in his hands. Another muttered curses under his breath. They had walked into court expecting victory and walked out burdened with ruin. The teenager did not gloat. He did not smirk or celebrate. He simply nodded, his calm composure never breaking. It was the dignity of someone who had not fought for revenge but for justice. His silence was louder than any cheer could have been. The judge slammed his gavel one final time. This case is dismissed. Court is adjourned. The sound echoed through the chamber, not as a mark of authority but as a death knell for the HOA. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, gasps, and whispers. Some spectators shook their heads in disbelief, while others nodded with admiration, their eyes locked on the boy who had just rewritten the story of the day. But the story wasn't over yet. As the judge rose from the bench, his robes flowing behind him, he paused. For a moment, his mask slipped, revealing the raw humiliation etched into his face. He glanced once more at the boy but quickly looked away. The humiliation was too much to bear. A man who had mocked and belittled countless defendants had been forced to bow in his own way to someone he once dismissed as a child. The courtroom emptied slowly, but whispers filled the halls. Reporters scribbled notes frantically. Phones buzzed with texts and calls. Word was already spreading. A teenage attorney had walked into court and dismantled an HOA, a seasoned lawyer, and even a judge, all in one day. Outside the courthouse, the boy was met with a crowd. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, voices clamored for his attention. People wanted to know his story. They wanted to hear every detail, every secret of how a teenager had risen to such brilliance. But he didn't linger. He walked calmly through the crowd, politely declining questions, his folder tucked under his arm. For him, this wasn't about fame or spectacle. It was about proving a point, that truth, preparation, and intellect could outshine arrogance, no matter how powerful. The HOA members stumbled out shortly after, their faces pale and their reputations shredded. Some argued among themselves, their voices cracking under the weight of their defeat. Others simply hung their heads, knowing they would never live down the embarrassment of being dismantled by a teenager. And somewhere in the courthouse, the judge sat alone in his chambers. His gavel lay on the desk, silent and heavy. He stared at the wall, the echo of his own laughter ringing in his mind, mocking him now. He had thought himself untouchable, but today he had been broken. Not by another judge, not by a veteran attorney, but by a boy who refused to bow. That humiliation would follow him forever. For the teenager, though, the story was just beginning. His name would spread across the legal community like wildfire. Some would celebrate him as a prodigy. Others would resent him, fearing the disruption of tradition and hierarchy. But none could deny what they had seen. He had been mocked, underestimated, and dismissed. And yet, in that very same courtroom, he had risen, dismantled his enemies, and walked out victorious. The courthouse doors closed behind him, the crowd's noise fading into the distance. He took a deep breath of the evening air, steady and calm, and walked forward, into a future he had already proven was his to command. For those who witnessed it, the memory would never fade. The day a judge mocked a teenager, only to discover that the teenager was a genius attorney in disguise. The day arrogance was silenced, and brilliance prevailed. The verdict was not just written in law books. It was written in the minds of everyone who had been there. And the legend of Attorney Williams had only just begun.